Hello, my name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm very happy to welcome you to this event. I am joined today by Dr. Gregg Twietmeyer, who is an
Oh,
associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology here at Mississippi State. Hello, Greg.
how you doing?
Good, thanks. I'm also here with Dr. Scott Kretchmar, who is professor emeritus in the Department of Kinesiology at Penn State University. Hello, Dr. Kretchmar.
Greetings, Julia.
Thank you both for being here this afternoon. So I understand that you both are in the Department of Kinesiology at your respective universities, but can you tell me a little bit more about what you specialize in and what you study?
Sure. I actually studied with Dr. Kretchmar at Penn State. I got my PhD there between 2004 and 2008 in the history and philosophy of sport. And although the degree says history and philosophy, everybody that takes that PhD emphasizes one or the other. You have to do both to make yourself marketable, but you emphasize one or the other. I emphasize philosophy with Dr. Kretchmar. And that's the main research focus that I have and teaching focus that I have here at Mississippi State.
And I do philosophy of sport. I did it at Penn State. I'm still writing, even though I've been retired for a number of years. They keep asking me to teach, and foolishly, I keep agreeing to do so. So I taught this last fall by Zoom, my first attempt at that. I studied philosophy at the University of Southern California in the philosophy department for my graduate work, but my degrees are all in physical education because I love sport. And so I've always been in physical education departments, and I've always examined sport from the humanities side.
So what is sports philosophy? Because when I think of sports, I'm thinking of people playing on the field. Is it, do I take that shot or not take that shot? How does this work? Either of you, you're both sports philosophers.
I would
sports
say
philosophy?
it's all the branches of philosophy applied to the lived experience and reflection upon the play and games that people love. So ethics is the most obvious area that people are aware of related to sport philosophy. Issues of Title IX, performance enhancing drugs, all the stuff you see in the news, cheating, the Houston Astros cheating their way to the World Series a couple of years ago, and so forth. But it's broader than that too. It's metaphysical questions. It's questions of aesthetics. What's beautiful about sport? Is there an objective definition of beautiful sport? Is soccer the beautiful game in an objective way? Is it better than baseball? And so forth.
I can answer that, Greg. It's not. Baseball is a much better game, but to further answer Julia's question, another major issue has to do with a kind of a paradox. We humans put a lot of energy into things like baseball, and some people call them silly games. They don't produce anything.
Right.
If you're just playing for fun, if you're playing for recreation, they don't make anything. And so we wonder why we spend so much emotional energy. I know you folks down in Mississippi care a little bit about your football team down there. And I've seen some pictures of people yelling and putting paint on their face and doing really totally irrational things. We at Penn State would never do that. But why do we care so much about play, games, sport, dance, things that are sort of on the side of life? They're not directly related to our survival, but yet they mean so much to us. We philosophers, Greg included, Dr. Twietmeyer included, mess with those kinds of questions.
And so you're talking about philosophy, but Greg, you said that you had to kind of get your PhD in philosophy and history of sport. So are there other sports humanities besides philosophy and history? You mentioned ethics, you mentioned aesthetics as part of philosophy, but are there other things that people look at sports that use humanistic disciplines?
In terms of academic disciplines that have thriving communities, it's basically three: sport philosophy, sport history, and sport sociology. You could throw in sport psychology there, depending on where you slide psychology on that scale between the sciences and the humanities. Obviously, there's a humanistic strain in psychology. My read of psychology is it's pushed and pushed and pushed more in a scientific direction, but there's certainly sports psychology angles that could be taken related to the humanities. Then the other is the arts related to literature, film, and so forth.
So if somebody, and by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, I have several questions for these sports humanists, but if any of our viewers or anybody listening, if you have a question for either Dr. Twietmeyer or Dr. Kretchmar, if you could just put it in the comment section below the video that you're watching right now, I would love to ask it on your behalf or inject a comment on your behalf. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions. But Gregg and Dr. Kretchmar, getting back to the questions that I was asking you a bit earlier. So, you're talking about sport and art and sport and philosophy and sport and psychology and sport and social sciences. So if somebody wanted to study sports in that way or using that methodology, do most people have to study that discipline first and then just apply it to sports? Or can you study sports philosophy and sports psychology and sports social sciences as their own disciplines in various places?
Yeah, let me start with that. Gregg was one of a number of doctoral students I had at Penn State over the years. And I would interview all of the would-be students before I accepted them into the program. And having an undergraduate major in philosophy was not a prerequisite. I would take individuals who had majored in physiology or majored in business or majored in all different kinds of things. My prerequisite something related to the humanities. They had to have experience in movement, human movement, some form, sport, exercise. I had one individual came who was a marathon runner. Because we philosophers deal with the subjective, the lived experience of sport. I could not teach a student in 3 years all the experience they need as a football player, a baseball player, a runner, a biker, a swimmer, a skier. They had to come with that. And I think another thing that was important for me is that they came with a passion, a love for that activity. It wasn't just an academic exercise for them. It wasn't for me when I went to graduate school. I really wanted answers to questions about why sport, why physical activity, what does my body mean as a person? How am I related to this physical hunk of flesh that I carry around with me? And so those were the key things. And then I would say I could train them myself. And so between me and the philosophy department over 3 years or a little more than 3 years, my students would get a good enough background to think well, write well, like Dr. Twietmeyer has done since he's graduated.
I would follow up on that real quick, just with a little anecdote. When I went out to interview at Penn State, I was in Dr. Kretchmar's office on spring break of 2004. There was nobody else around. And rec hall's this big labyrinth. It was like getting through a maze to find him. And I sat down at his desk, and the first question he asked me, because this is how it's related to your initial question, I wasn't a philosophy major undergrad, I was an art major. And his first question was, what does art have to do with sport? And my immediate instinctual answer was play, which apparently was exactly what he wanted to hear.
So if I can go back to something y'all mentioned a little earlier, but that's very much related to what Gregg just said. Why do we need sports? Why do human beings care so much about, people running around with a ball or a stick or whatever it is? Why does this? And it's interesting. Whenever I check the news, I like to look at the news on BBC, the British news website, and the top part's all international news and who's waging war on whom and politics and everything, and then the last third of the page is always English football. on this big international news site. So why do we care so much about sports? Give me the short answer.
The short answer is that people are meaning-seeking creatures. We need to have purpose in our life. We have to have things we care about. We care about our spouses, our loved ones, our children. We care about our jobs and our vocations and the things we're dedicated to. But our caring doesn't stop there. And so I think the short answer is sport, for reasons that Gregg and I have been researching for years, attracts us. It allows us to care deeply about something, getting better, winning, rooting for a favorite team. There are lots of ways we care in sport. In some ways, it's like religion, because that's another place where we grow into life caring deeply about how things come out.
Mm-hmm.
And so we invest, we trust, we have faith. And sport requires very similar kinds of attitudes.
I have heard football being called a religion in Mississippi many, many, many times, but you make a very good case there. Gregg, do you have anything to add?
I would just add the basic philosophic distinction of intrinsic versus extrinsic goods. And in one way, usefulness and the extrinsic are our immediate priority, as Dr. Kretchmar alluded to before. You know, if you don't have a roof over your head, food in your stomach, you aren't going to be around for long. But once you take care of that, the immediate question is, now what? And the intrinsic goods, being good in themselves, don't succumb to that problem, right? If something is beautiful, you pursue it simply for its own sake. And sport, like religion, is one of those realms of intrinsic value, intrinsic purpose, where we pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful simply because that's what it is, not because it's useful, not because it'll fill our stomach or fill our bank account, but because, as Dr. Kretchmar said, we need meaning in our lives.
And so we play sports.
Well, it's not the only thing, hopefully. But yeah, absolutely.
It's something a lot of us do. Or if you're like myself,
Right.
I'm not much of a player, but I certainly watch them.
Right. We can, if you think about food, for example, or nutrition, it skates this line perfectly, right? If you just talk to a nutritionist, they could just chop up the food, stick it on a plate, and say, here's what you want to eat. But the presentation, the cooking, the flavor, all that matters too, right? We want to live well, not just live healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what Gregg and I are talking about is something that's very important, because to oversimplify matters, people in physical education and kinesiology tend to fall on one of two sides of the scale. And a number of my colleagues, some of them very good colleagues, because both sides of the scale have some arguments in favor of them. Many of my colleagues are public health people. They march to the drummer of good health. The reason we exist in the public schools for the kids, the reason we exist in the colleges to promote health. And so we do push-ups, we do sit-ups and jumping jacks, and we run people around the track. We try to help people lose weight. We try to keep people alive. You know, we carry hunter-gatherer kinds of cardiovascular systems that aren't meant for sitting. And statistics now show that sitting kills, just like smoking cigarettes and doing other things. So that side of physical education is an important one. We want to live longer. We want to have energy and health. But Gregg and I are birds of a feather on the other side of the coin. And I didn't give this to him. He came this way when he first met me. We care more about quality of life. And then health becomes a byproduct. And I always tell my students, if you love to run, if you love to bicycle, if you love to ski, your heart rate's going to go up. And you're going to have meaning in your life. And some of the psychologists that Gregg mentioned, or you mentioned earlier, are showing now that attitude matters to health. And so if we have a life filled with meaning and things we love doing, that in itself promotes health. Mm-hmm. Even though that's not the main objective that I'm in phys ed for. I taught skill classes for a year, golf, distance running, racquetball, and my main objective objective was always to have the kids fall in love with the activity. End of story.
Well, you're talking about kind of this sport as this very good thing. It's kind of this intrinsic good thing. And it's something that, we do because we enjoy and we want to live, very happy lives. And then if we're doing these things we enjoy, then we will be healthy as a result. But you also mentioned earlier sports ethics. It's no secret right now that there are lots and lots of conversations about the ethics of various sports. Are student athletes really professional at this point? Should they be paid? Are they really amateur? Should they not be paid? Would it kill, university sports if we started paying athletes, et cetera? That's just one of many, many, many questions. People are worried about concussions, and people are worried about the amount of money we pay professional athletes and the relationship between professional athletics and the Department of Defense in some cases and things like that. I've got a colleague who writes on this. So what are some of the current ethical issues with professional or college sports that you are most worried about or you are following right now?
Well, I would mention three that I don't think get enough attention.
Mm-hmm.
The first is the growth of gambling in sports. And other than the obvious back and forth on that debate of the health of gambling as a pursuit, I think the larger issue that people really aren't talking about is the leagues getting in bed with the casinos. So Major League Baseball, for example, recently signed, as I believe have all the other major American sports, a proprietary data contract with casinos in Las Vegas, which means that their advanced analytic statistics go to Vegas, and Vegas has inside information that the fans don't have, which means that the scales are tipped in the direction of the casinos even more. And baseball is making money indirectly off the backs of the average fan who is ignorant of the way the system's set up to give proprietary data to the casinos so that they're more likely to lose.
Mm.
The second one would be the issue of Roboumps. We tend to think of that purely as a technological issue. When will we have the technology to do it well? I think
I'm sorry, what is it that you just mentioned?
Roboumps. So should the strike zone be called by an umpire or should it be called by a computer?
Oh, a robotic umpire.
I would argue for a host of philosophical reasons that we don't necessarily need to get into any detail on that Roboumps can't work. But even if they could work, it would be counterproductive. It would dehumanize baseball in important ways. And it would deny the reality of judgment, which is necessary in all human endeavor, from the scientific deep bench sciences all the way down to the allegedly purely subjective humanities and so forth. And then the third one is probably the one I'm most worried about, and that is the professionalization of youth sport, where we turn kids into little recruits at 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. I was just reading an article in The Athletic this week about parents paying tens of thousands of dollars to get their preteen kids with quarterback gurus so they can land that big scholarship. And the lead example in this article was a father deciding his son would be a quarterback at age 5. Obviously, this isn't healthy for the kids, or at least there's a real danger it's not going to be healthy for the kids. It's not healthy for any parent's pocketbooks, and it immediately eliminates a whole bunch of kids for socioeconomic and other reasons from that deep, meaningful experience we were talking about, because they get priced out of it or eliminated because they're not good enough at the ripe old age of 7, 8, 9 years old.
Wow. Wow. And you're talking about that. That's making me think even of some things I've read about ballet, grooming young, especially young women to be ballerinas when they're very, very, very little. And in some ways risking that kind of love of sport or that kind of love of movement that you were talking about in the first place. What are you worried about, Dr. Kretchmar?
Wow. I like the three that Gregg chose. There's no shortage in sport of ethical issues. I've been on panels on youth sport. I've been on panels dealing with whether athletes should be paid, college athletes should be paid or not. And I've been on panels that talk about drugs, anabolic steroids, and whether or not they should be not allowed. So there are so many issues. I think some personal ones for me. One of them is an old issue. It's gender equity.
Right.
Title IX was a hot button when it put in place, and it's still a hot button politically. People who are on the men's side of athletics blame Title IX for the cutting of wrestling, the cutting of men's volleyball, and some of the men's teams because there's not enough money to go around. And they point the finger directly at the women and say, if we didn't have Title IX, those teams would still be here. I don't know what has happened in Mississippi in that regard, but a number of schools in the Big Ten where we are have cut programs, particularly men's programs, to meet Title IX requirements. The statistics show that it's not Title IX primarily, it's the exorbitant expenditures in men's football and men's basketball. If you look at the budget at any big Division I school, you'll see that ungodly amounts of money go to those two programs. And so, yeah, if you're going to spend half your budget on those two front porch programs, and they are important programs for the visibility of our schools, you're not going to have money left over for women's sports or men's sports, or at least not many of them. So I worry about Title IX, women's opportunities to play, by extension, handicapped kids' chances to play, people who are sort of out of the mainstream of elite sport. So it's kind of a play on Gregg's idea of the youth sport. Who are the people who don't have power and are not in the limelight, and are they getting good sport experiences? Do they have a chance to fall in love with sport?
Yeah, related to the piggyback off that larger theme, I would add another one, and that is the neglect and decline of physical education in our schools, and arguably more importantly in our colleges and universities.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of kinesiology programs that are eliminating it as a major in their departments.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you bring this up, because I actually have a question on our Facebook page. And just a reminder, if you have a question for either of these gentlemen, please do put it in the comment section below the video, and I'll be sure to ask it. But we do have a question from Maddie Bass asking if there are reoccurring gender differences that you see in the sports humanities that you teach. So not necessarily even in sports, but in the sports humanities, do you see if there are reoccurring gender differences, to quote Maddie, or is it predominantly male or female, the students who take your classes or who go into this field?
Yes.
Okay.
Men on average are taller. So, that's indisputable. But I'm a little bit of a renegade on this because I'm not afraid of talking about the differences. My daughter played Division I basketball, so I've got women in the family who are very gifted athletically. The big question, one of the big questions, is it Maddie who asked the question?
Yes.
One of the big questions, Maddie, has to do with whether it's nature or nurture. Are women raised differently in our culture, enough differently that they think differently, they play differently, they compete differently, and so forth? Or is there something more fundamental to our biological makeup, that we come into the world oriented just a little bit differently on the male side and the female side, and all the blends in between the two binary categories of male, female? I think it's both and. I think there's a degree of nature. We are different by nature to a small degree. We're human mostly. To a small degree, I think by nature we're a little different. And then, of course, by our upbringing, how we're raised to think of ourselves in our gender is different. So there are a lot of interesting issues about whether men should coach women's sports. because men have been raised differently to think differently about sports, and maybe genetically they're a little bit different too. Or should women coach women's sports? And now there are a number of questions about the in-between people, people who are not clearly one gender or the other, or they're transgender, and they're questions of fairness, they're questions of opportunity. Where should they compete? How should they compete? And as you're probably aware in the media, there are a lot of hot issues about Caster Semenya and whether her unusual biological makeup should keep her from competing in women's categories. Mm-hmm. So gender is an important issue. And from my perspective, I don't get hung up on sex, I hope. I get hung up on people who don't get a chance to play. And I don't want gender to get in the way of that.
Right. Gregg, did you want to add something to that question, or you think it's been answered well?
I would say I would echo his thoughts that it's a hot button issue. I think there's a deep connection to metaphysics and the nature of the human person there that needs more attention. Dr. Kretchmar mentioned before, what am I? Why do I have a body? What is my body? Is my body me? That's all related to that issue. It's such a hot button issue. I don't think that there's enough careful, considerate, dispassionate analysis that goes on.
My recommendation for if there are any untenured professors listening out there, don't do your research on that until you get tenured.
Correct. I would agree.
Good advice.
I would agree. Whatever you think on that issue, it's an issue that's not going to go away.
Right. And there's also another comment here on our Facebook comments. This is from George Dunn, and I think relating back to what you were saying earlier, Gregg, about the problem with gambling and also the problem with robotic umpires. He's posted an article about how baseball is more than a sport, but an example of a functioning legal system. It's its own legal system. And that kind of leads me to ask, to what extent does professional baseball or football or, any sport, or the SEC or the NBA or any large professional sports organization or quasi-professional sports organization care what you guys think? Are you in dialogue with any of these companies that you make money off of athletes or that organize the athletics, or do you just kind of sit on the benches and make commentary from a distance?
Well, by and large, the answer is no. They don't care what we think. It's not absolutely true. The NCAA reached out and had a symposium that Dr. Kretchmar was part of between academics and coaches and administrators, about 10, 15 years ago now?
Yeah, when Miles Brand was president of the NCAA.
Occasionally you will have a journalist or somebody reach out to you. I had somebody from the Houston Chronicle do that to me about 4 or 5 months ago related to the Astro scandal. But our influence is almost always indirect.
One of the places where we have had an impact is on the issue of policies regarding performance enhancement, drug taking. The IOC, the USOC, the Olympic committees have invited trained philosophers of sport to sit on their panels to help them work through rationales for the drug policies. Typically, these organizations, partly because of public pressure, are anti-drug. Mm-hmm. There are other reasons too, health reasons and so forth, but for public relations reasons, most people prefer to think of sport as drug-free and so forth. And so philosophers are needed to be at the table to talk about good reasons for why we prohibit this and why we allow that. Mm-hmm. Why do we allow a certain chemical to go into our bodies, but we don't allow another chemical to go into our bodies? What's the reason? And the institutions are interested in making sure that fans see it's not arbitrary. They're not just saying, arbitrarily, I say you're not allowed to drink coffee before you go to a soccer game. There needs to be a reason for it, and it needs to be articulated well. And philosophers are good at giving reasons and articulating. And so they call on us. And Gregg mentioned the scholarly colloquium for the NCAA. Miles Brand, who died of pancreatic cancer tragically a number of years ago now, was an unusual president of the NCAA. Usually, administrators of multi-million-dollar enterprises like the NCAA want to keep academics at arm's length. They don't trust us because we tend to be critical.
Right.
We tend to say, you know, you're not doing it right, and so forth. Miles Brand was different. And he was a philosopher of sport like I am, and that's why I got involved. And he called me one day and said, we need to get academics more engaged in studying intercollegiate sport. And I said to him, aren't you afraid if you start inviting people like Gregg and me under the tent that it's going to get worse? You know, we're just going to be throwing hand grenades at you guys. And he said, no. He said, I believe in the, on balance, college sport is very good for kids.
Mm-hmm.
That was his deep belief. And he said, if we have good scholars looking at that, there are going to be some negative things. He knew there are problems in big time sport, especially. But he said, if we have good scholars looking at it, the good's going to come out too. So I want good scholars studying intercollegiate sport. And for a brief shining moment of about 7 years, we had scholarly colloquiums at annual NCAA meetings. And Miles and I started a journal, the Journal of Intercollegiate Sport, that still exists today, where there's hopefully good scholarship on intercollegiate athletics. So there should be a marriage, but Gregg's right. By and large, they keep us away.
I'm sorry to hear that, because it just, as a humanist, or just even as a teacher, someone who teaches at a university, you know, I have taught at two very sports heavy universities, and you get college athletes, and you know, sometimes it's just very clear that, like, oh, your level of preparation indicates that, you know, maybe you're not quite ready to be in this class yet, but somehow they've managed to get here anyway, and you kind of wonder how this happened and things. Or you get very worried. I used to get very worried that, you know, I'm teaching you some very basic things right now, but then when I ask you to write a very long paper in about 2 weeks, and I'm sure I'm going to get a paper from you, not quite sure where that paper will have come from, and things like that. But it's, you know, you don't, you're not always encouraged to ask too many questions about these kinds of things. So I guess my follow-up question for you then is, you know, you seem very impassioned about, you know, some of the ethical problems that you see in sport. You both are very concerned about access. You're both very concerned about sport staying, for lack of a better word, fun and meaningful to the people who play them. So does this kind of lead on that you both, that being a sports philosopher or a sports humanist leads to some kind of activism? Do you find yourself, you know, trying to influence policy or legislation regarding gambling, or, you know, how old children have to be involved in certain sports or things like that?
Speaking for myself, I would say it really depends on your definition of activism. If you have a broad definition, I would say absolutely. I coach youth soccer. I've been very involved in the Starksville Soccer Association. I've run a camp here and in West Virginia for the last 7, 8 years to help teach special needs children how to ride a bike. That all falls out of philosophy. In fact, I learned about the program because I was searching for examples to use in my sport philosophy class. And then when I realized it was something that traveled around the country, I said, well, why can't it be here? And maybe it should be here. And if I don't do anything about it, nobody's going to, and so forth. So I would be a little hesitant, only because the word activism in day-to-day conversation tends to skew to one side of the political spectrum and always mean political. But in the sense of being engaged in your community and putting philosophy into practice and using what you've learned to try and make the world a better place, I would think every scholar does that.
Yeah, I was in a situation in the year 2000 where I was happy doing my research and my teaching, and somebody approached me and said, would you be willing to be the faculty athletics rep to the NCAA for Penn State University? And my initial reaction was, of course not. I've got plenty to do, and why would I stick my finger into that mess? And long and short of it is I eventually did say yes and did it. And it was an interesting experience because I had to walk a line between being the kind of activist that Gregg was talking about, the one that gets, the bad name for being a super critic of everything that's going on, because I had to have a relationship with the coaches. I had to have a reasonably positive relationship with the coaches. But I'm an ethics teacher, for heaven's sakes. I have to call a spade when something bad happens.
Yeah,
Right.
you get in a real big trouble if you don't, as North Carolina makes clear, because one of the major actors there was a sports ethics teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, I could tell you so many war stories. Some of them, well, I can't tell them publicly, but I have many war stories that have to do with ethics, with professors calling me on the phone, for example, saying the starting linebacker for Penn State football team was cheating on my test this afternoon. What should I do? I can tell you that story. I had a very easy answer to that. I said, you do exactly the same thing you would do for any other student at Penn State University. Do not change your behavior because he's a starting linebacker on the football team. You're in charge of your classroom. You have the standards for your class. Treat him like you would treat the other kids. But, I had all kinds of, there's a famous 20-hour rule. That is, athletes are not allowed to spend more than 20 hours a week by NCAA rules on required athletic activities.
Keyword.
Yeah, required athletic. It doesn't count competition. This is practice, chalk talks, weight sessions, and so forth. I had a young lady walk into my office one day and said, Dr. Kretchmar, I have to tell you that our coach is just violating the 20-hour rule from start to finish. We're spending 30 hours at least a week required to be on this person's team. And so this was a coach of a big name team and a big name coach. I had to go to the coach and say, cut it out. These kids are students. They have a life. And I know you're under a lot of pressure to win, but cut it back, play by the rules. And so, there were difficult kinds of situations, but overall, it was a good situation, fortunately, for me at Penn State, because most of the coaches were very good about trying to balance the student athlete requirements. And so, and I coached Little League and a million stories like Gregg too, to try to do it the right way. And good people. When I gave a talk on little person sport, they were asking, what would you do to reform kids' sports? I had two answers. Give the kids new parents. and the second was give them a different coach. That's where a lot of the trouble comes. And my own experience in teaching my daughter soccer and my son baseball.
Do you find yourself, when you would go to their games, would you find yourself being that parent saying, no, kick it over there, the coach should have put you in? Or were you very good at sitting on your hands since you knew how it was to be that coach?
I was 50-50. I was pretty good. But it's emotional. When your kid's out there, you can't rationalize it. You care big time. Yeah. Your eyes follow your kid, even though rationally I know every other kid out there is equally deserving of my eyes. You follow your kid. And it's just the way we are as parents. We love our kids and we want them to do well. And so Yeah, I don't apologize for that. It's part of human nature. It's part of, I think, being a good parent. You love your kids more than you love somebody else's kids. You hope they have parents that love them like you love your kids. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting because on one hand, I'm hearing you talk and you all study kinesiology and you study sport and it is your life. And on the other side, you have, the coaches, like the kind that you were in communication with Dr. Kretchmar, and sport is their life and sport is their passion and everything. But you all seem to come at it from very different perspectives. Do coaches, do they have to take sports humanities or some kind of sports humanities at some point in their training or in their education? Even just as like a check in the block if you want to go into sports management or training or coaching or any of those more practical professions?
A lot of them do, but not because they have to. So most of the college and above coaches end up starting with the GA somewhere, graduate assistantship as a coach, and they have to be in a graduate program to be on the GA. And sport administration, sport management, and so forth is a common choice because of their interests. And most of those programs are going to have an ethics class if the program's anything close to accredited. But if you've got the connections, you're the starting linebacker at Ohio State or whatever, and you go to your coach and say, I think I want to be a coach too, and he dials up from his Rolodex 6 or 7 people that might need a GA, and they say, oh yeah, we really want Twietmeyer. He was a great linebacker at Ohio State. They don't care what you're majoring in. So there's a lot of coaches with no academic background in sport at all.
Yeah, the biggest predictor that I've seen in getting college level coaching jobs is connections. Who did you play for? Who did you assistant coach under? It's a networking kind of system. And so your credentials and whether or not you took a sport ethics class are so far down on the list, they're invisible. But your behavior is not invisible. And so there are some schools that will stay away from a coach who has a track record that's questionable, that's done some things. One of my jobs as faculty rep at Penn State was to be on searches of major coaching hires. Men's basketball was one of them when I was the 10 years I did it. And we brought in some really big name coaches. I mean, names that everybody here listening would know right off the bat. And we were at a meeting with the president and so forth, and we were debating whether or not to make an offer to this big name coach because we don't have good basketball at Penn State. We need a support. So everybody's sort of rooting that we get in a big name coach to turn the program around. And the president turned to our athletic director and said, "Are you okay with this hire?" And our athletic director, who had done a lot of research with other coaches in the Big Ten and done some work on this coach we were thinking about, said, "I'm not, because I would think within 3 years we'll have an NCAA investigation here about wrongdoing." The coach was known to run around the rules a little bit. And said, the president said, "That's all I need to hear. We're not going to do it." And we hired in a different direction. So coaching behavior does make a difference in some schools, but boy, one of the things that upsets me as much as anything is seeing a coach getting fired at school A for malpractice and then getting hired at school B for a higher salary.
Oh,
Within 3 years, he can be fired from there for malpractice.
Because he wins. That's what matters.
do you find just go ahead?
I was just to say, on the positive side, there has been a slow, emphasize slow, but steady growth in coaching education majors. Oklahoma State, for example, has a very well-regarded program. The problem with that, of course, is it's not required, and the students that go into it tend to end up at the lower levels, high schools and so forth, which is good for those high schools, assuming the program's doing a good job. But the ethical pressures, the temptations are, of course, exponentially higher the higher you go. So it's, in a way, not serving where the demand ought to be the greatest.
Right. So you, Dr. Kretchmar, if I may, you brought up salary a few minutes ago. And that was kind of making me wonder, does money ruin sports? And I ask that because, the big money-making sports tend to be the ones that seem to attract the most controversy or the most ethical violations. I hear a lot of conversation about, college students in football or college students in baseball or college students in basketball. I hear a lot less concern about college students in track or college students in wrestling or college students in some of those sports that don't make money for the university. So if we just cut money from sports, would all of our problems be solved?
Well, there are a lot of reform models out there, and one of them is to do that. Hive off basketball, football, hockey. They're up here. I don't know if you guys don't play hockey, right?
I don't know what that word means.
Baseball would be analogous down here.
Okay, yeah. Hive off the sports that make your money and put them in a separate category. And then you can have different rules and different protocols and different salaries for coaches in the non-money making sports. And they'd be more like Division III. We've been talking so much Division I here. Division III is big time sport. I mean, there are way more Division III schools than Division I think. And there are a lot of kids who are having good experiences at the Division III level.
Or the NAI level, speaking as a former NAI athlete.
NAI level. And their coaches are not making $1 million or $5 million or $6 million like our football coach. So, there's a lot of college sport that is not money driven. I went to a liberal arts school and all admission was free. You couldn't buy a ticket if you tried. You just went to the game, but nobody went. We played without too many people there because it was amateur sport. It was sport for the fun of it. And, we didn't need to have 100,000 people yelling for us, as exciting as that is. So yeah, money's a problem, but big time sport is not going away. And I've been on so many reform panels that I know it's not going to happen unless what some reformers refer to as a tsunami event. There has to be something so egregiously bad that it blows up the system. And people sit back and say, we can't do this anymore. The marriage of education and big time sport is killing the reputation of higher education. We've got to divorce ourselves. But we've had a lot of very big events.
That's what I was just about to say. If you'd say Penn State, Michigan State, Baylor, what do you think?
Yeah, we've had a
Penn
lot
State,
of
Michigan State, Baylor, North Carolina.
Yeah, that isn't a big enough tsunami. One that Gregg mentioned, interestingly, has been brought up on some of the reform groups I've sat on, and that's gambling. If it turns out that someday there's systematic gambling, fixing of games, big time sport, and it's reasonably pervasive, that could kill the goose. That could kill the golden goose. And so ADs in big time sport lie awake at night worrying about gambling.
And is this the kind of thing that where someone who wanted to win a lot of money on a game might bribe a player to throw the game or something like that? This is what they're concerned about?
The gamblers are unbelievable. At Penn State, we've had people paid by Las Vegas, let's say, somebody, to work for them as an agent. They're a student, they're a bona fide student at Penn State, but they're being paid by somebody to become a friend of one of the football players or one of the basketball players. They're in a class with them, and the student has no idea that they're being paid by gamblers to get this person to throw a game. And so when they establish this kind of connection, then they finally talk to the person. You can get $50,000 if you miss a couple foul shots in the next game and make sure da-da-da-da-da. That is happening today in big time sport. And so it's scary. At Penn State, we did buku education on that. I sat in on some of those sessions, and all of our athletes heard stories about those kinds of events. here's what you need to be worried about. Here's what you need to have your eyes open for, because you could hurt yourself for the rest of your life, and you could hurt sport at Penn State for the rest of your life if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm. Boy, yeah, because I'm always worried about athlete education, because I want to make sure as a history teacher that they get their history, and that, you know, they do their readings and they write their papers and they learn how to write, and these are important skills, even if you go on to be a professional athlete and everything. But from what you're describing, it sounds like student athletes are getting a whole other kind of education, not just in the sport they're playing, and certainly not just in the classes they're taking, but in navigating this kind of nefarious web that they're stuck in.
Yep.
Yeah, related to the question that started off this part of the conversation, you know, what should we think of money? I would point back to intrinsic versus extrinsic goods and say money is a great tool, but it's a tool. And we get our priorities mixed up. We get ourselves in trouble. Money corrupts sport when it becomes the end instead of a means. We're supposed to use money to make sport better, not prostitute sport in every direction we can to generate more money. But that's often what happens.
Yeah, with regard to that intrinsic, extrinsic thing, one of the saddest things I ever experienced as a faculty rep at Penn State was a kid came into my office one day, a football player, and he said, "Coach," they called me coach, I wasn't a coach. "Coach, you know, when I played football in high school, it was so much fun. I lived for football. It was the greatest game." He said, "But I have to tell you now, it's a job.
Yeah.
I don't like to go to practice anymore. It's too much." And to have somebody do the reverse trip of the one that Gregg and I are about, where they love sport and then came to hate it or dislike it, is the opposite direction. Rather than starting with something that's new to you, you're not sure you're going to like it, and end up it adorns your life until you're my age and you still do it.
Yeah. I think a lot of kids probably have a story like that one, where they were really jazzed about something and something just killed it for them, unfortunately.
Yeah, the Aspen Institute in Colorado does a bunch of research on this with Utah State academics, I believe, if I remember right. It's some school in Utah. And their most recent report said kids quit organized youth sport at age 11. And one of the leading reasons they give is it's not fun anymore. At 11.
Too much pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot. Well, I mean, and like you said earlier, I mean, nowadays, because money, sport can be such a ticket, right? It can be your ticket to college. It can be your ticket to fame and fortune afterwards. You can be set if you get into the right sport. And so there's all this pressure that, oh, you're showing some talent. Oh, you're showing some potential. You need to harness it. Or you might not even be competitive later on. You might not be competitive when you're 15 if you don't harness it by the time you're 11.
Or you will, and you won't be having any fun anyway. So what was the point? The other thing you got to remember is it's a lottery ticket. Most kids, doesn't matter how much they train, aren't going to be good enough to get a college scholarship. And it's a very expensive lottery ticket, which means even if you land it, most kids don't get full rides, even in Division I, unless it's football or basketball. And that means if you're spending 10 grand a year on training over a 6 or 7, 8, 10-year period, you start at 5, it's going to be 10, 12 years at 10 grand a year. It doesn't matter how much scholarship you're going to get, you're going to end up in the hole.
Yep. And then for those athletes who maybe they even do get a full ride to college, but they don't make the pros, and they've sacrificed a lot of education and their own health, et cetera, to excel at the sport, you know, then what do you do when you're 23 years old and you've kind of been used up a bit?
You've defined your whole life around this one goal.
Yeah.
So I don't want to end on this kind of a sad note. What then is our responsibility as humanists, as sports humanists, as not so sports humanists, as, you know, as someone who enjoys watching or as someone who enjoys teaching? What is our responsibility, or what can we do to intervene in this kind of process that we've been talking about? Or what can we do to ensure that sports continues for the love of it and not for the cash of it?
Philosophically, I would say we have to emphasize play and then emphasize play and then emphasize play and then emphasize play again. Practically, I think the number one goal, which I think is very difficult at this point, but if we wanted to make a difference, the number one goal would be reinvigorate physical education. both in our universities and schools?
Yeah, I would say education and opportunity. Some people don't like to move because they're not good at it. They haven't had a good physical education experience. They haven't learned how to catch a ball or throw a ball or how to swim or how to ski or how to bike and so forth. We need good teachers who educate them. You know, my wife was an English teacher, and her job was to turn people on to good literature, novels. And it's a hard job. A lot of kids don't like to read. They don't like to get into books. We face the same thing in phys ed. Some kids don't like to swim. They're scared of they're afraid of the water. They don't like to do things that make them sweat. And so education is crucial. And the second thing is opportunity, that we have to have more playgrounds, more places where everybody, no matter how skilled you are or how rich you are or whatever, gets a chance to experience the joy of movement.
Okay, great. Well, I will end on that note. Thank you very much, Dr. Kretchmar, for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Twietmeyer, for joining the Institute for Humanities again, and for talking to me today. Any final thoughts before I sign us off of Facebook?
I would just say I'm very proud of Dr. Twietmeyer, and it's wonderful to see him thriving down there in Mississippi.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Julia, for hosting us. This was a great conversation.
All right. Well, thank you again. And for all of you who are listening and watching, I'm looking forward to seeing you at our next What Are the Humanities Anyway program, which will be on the traditional humanities sometime in March. So stay tuned. And again, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.